The mountain gave way beneath Clara Sterling's boots just as the sky split open and sent the whole black ridge sliding toward the river. Rain hammered her shoulders, the waterfall roared like judgment in the dark, and when her foot hit slick stone she pitched sideways, one hand clawing at moss, the other still clamped around the lantern she had no right to be carrying in a storm like this. For one blind and breathless instant, with thunder bursting above her and 5-year-old Ruthie waiting alone in their wagon below the trees, Clara vanished behind the white fury of falling water and stumbled into a world no living soul had seen in years. The force of the torrent had numbed her left arm to the elbow, and the cold struck so deep it felt as if the mountain itself had reached into her bones, but Clara did not fall again. She caught herself against stone slick as ice, sucked in a ragged breath, and lifted the lantern high enough for its trembling flame to throw a small amber ring through the gloom. The air behind the cascade was strangely still, hushed beneath that constant crashing veil, and what the light touched did not look like the ruined hollow of some animal den or a miner's abandoned cut. It looked shaped, worked, chiseled by hand and guarded by time. Water streamed past the hidden opening like a silver curtain, and beyond it, under the shelter of the cliff, a narrow ledge curved into a stone grotto just wide enough for a woman to walk. Clara's heart pounded so hard she could hear it over the storm. Then the lantern found the far wall, and her breath stopped entirely. There, built straight into the mountain as neatly as if the cliff had grown around it, stood a log cabin no map had marked, no neighbor had ever named, and no rumor in 3 counties had ever once suggested was real. It was small, but pristine beneath its blanket of dust, with hand-hewn beams dark and tight. A square-paned window turned inward toward the cavern, and a stout cedar door lifted above the damp floor by a row of flat stones. It looked impossible. It looked untouched. It looked like a secret sealed by a dead man's silence and a mountain's mercy. Clara moved toward it the way a starving soul moves toward warm bread, half afraid it would dissolve like mist if she blinked. She pushed the door, and the hinges answered in a long low groan, not broken by rust but heavy with disuse. Inside waited a room as strange and intimate as a memory preserved in amber. A cot stood beneath folded blankets protected by waxed canvas. Shelves lined the wall with jars, lamp oil, dried herbs turned brown with age, and tools wrapped in cloth. A narrow table faced the stone, and above it hung a surveyor's chain, 2 drafting rulers, and a military compass polished to a dull gold. In one corner rested a black iron stove, and beside it sat a chest bearing initials Clara knew before her mind could even form them. J.S. Jonathan Sterling. Her father. Captain Jonathan Sterling, soldier, scout, surveyor, and the hardest man she had ever loved. 3 months earlier he had died without calling for her, without explaining himself, without leaving her anything in his formal estate but a folded deed to a waterfall no sensible buyer would touch. No savings. No town lot. No herd. No respectable inheritance for a widow with a child. Just 36 acres of rock, spray, ravine, and pine along a cliff no horse could climb without stumbling. Men had laughed into their cups when they heard it. Women had tilted their heads with that sharp look reserved for daughters pitted and judged at once. Even before the mourning ribbon had faded from Clara's sleeve, Garrison Vance had come smiling to her door with a purchase offer that insulted the dead and preyed on the desperate. He told her the land was useless, too steep for fields, too wet for grazing, too dangerous for anyone but a fool. He said he was doing her a kindness. He said a widow did not need a waterfall. He said plenty of things in that honey-slow voice of his while Sheriff Silas Cole leaned against the fence outside, pretending not to listen. Clara had refused him then, not because she understood what her father had done, but because Jonathan Sterling had once told her that land men dismiss too quickly is the very land they most want to steal. Now, standing inside the hidden cabin, soaked to the skin and shaking with cold and shock, Clara understood she had only seen the edge of the truth. She dropped to her knees before the cedar chest and lifted the brass latch with fingers too numb to feel. Inside lay oilcloth bundles, ledgers, wax-sealed packets, a revolver wrapped in faded flannel, and 6 journals stacked with military precision. On top of them rested a letter addressed in her father's careful hand. For Clara, when the mountain is ready to answer. The storm vanished from her senses. The roar became distant. The whole world narrowed to that envelope. She broke the seal. Her father's words moved across the page like footsteps returning from the grave. He wrote that men were watching him. He wrote that the old claims north of the ravine had never run dry the way the territorial office reported. He wrote that he had found a seam of ore upstream and a tract of merchant timber below, enough to anchor the future of the Sterling line for generations if held together under lawful title. He wrote that he could trust neither local record keepers nor men who suddenly prospered every time a widow lost land or a veteran misplaced papers. He wrote that Garrison Vance had been buying fear and forging signatures for years under the protection of Sheriff Cole and a clerk in the district recorder's office. And he wrote, in lines that made Clara's stomach twist, that if anything happened to him before he could bring the matter to circuit court, everything she needed to reclaim what was theirs would be hidden behind the waterfall where no greedy man would think any value lived. Clara sat frozen while the rain slammed the mountain harder. Her father had known. Not guessed. Known. He had seen danger circling long before his chest gave out and his hands went cold. He had buried the truth where only stubborn blood and providence could uncover it. She reached for the journals next, and the first pages confirmed what the letter had begun. Jonathan Sterling had spent years surveying the mountain under government contract after the war, recording stream power, timber density, mineral traces, access cuts, and boundary stones others ignored. Tucked between those notes were copies of deeds, witness statements, supply invoices, and maps marked with red pencil. Clara spread them across the table under the lantern and watched her father's life become a weapon against the men who had looted his legacy. Here were original claim filings never entered into the county ledgers. Here were receipts proving he had paid taxes on adjoining tracts Vance later registered under shell purchasers. Here were 2 bills of sale with signatures so obviously false Clara recognized at once why her father never challenged them locally. No honest man could look at that ink and fail to see the fraud, yet somehow the papers had stood. Which meant honest men had never been allowed to look. A sudden crack from outside jerked her back to the present. Not thunder. Wood. Heavy boots on wet stone. Clara snatched up the letter and lantern and moved to the cabin window, shielding the flame. Through the watery shimmer of the falls she saw movement on the ledge. A lantern bobbed once, then again, the storm had hidden her from the trail, but not from watchful eyes below. Somewhere in the dark, Garrison Vance or one of his men had seen her disappear into the waterfall and had followed to learn what the mountain was hiding. Clara's fear rose hot and clean, burning away the paralysis of wonder. Ruthie. Her child was still down the slope in the wagon under the pine tarp, waiting for her mother to return with kindling and dry cloth. Clara did not allow herself to imagine what kind of men might reach that wagon first if they guessed she had found something worth defending. She worked fast. She bundled the journals and crucial deeds in waxed canvas, shoved them into a flour sack hanging on a peg, tucked the revolver into her waistband, and fed more oil to the lantern with hands that were steady now. Jonathan Sterling had prepared for this day. He had not hidden his life's proof so his daughter could cower in the dark and surrender it at the first boot step. The cabin had a second surprise waiting for her. Behind the cot, disguised by hanging blankets, a narrow crevice opened into a low stone passage angled downward through the cliff. Cold air breathed from it, carrying the scent of moss and pine needles rather than spray. An escape route. Of course there was one. Her father had built refuge with strategy, not sentiment. Clara took one last look around the room, memorizing every shelf, every beam, every sign that the dead had once stood here planning for the living. Then she lifted the sack and slipped into the passage. It bent sharply, forced her to crouch, and finally opened behind a shelf of broken granite 100 yards below the waterfall. From there she could see the wagon through the trees. Ruthie sat beneath the tarp exactly where Clara had left her, clutching her rag doll and peering into the rain with the patient solemnity only children and the deeply lonely ever truly master. Clara ran to her, gathered her into both arms, and felt the little girl's cold cheek press against her neck. She said nothing of cabins or forged deeds or hunted ledges. She only wrapped Ruthie tighter, climbed to the driver's board, and urged the mule into the storm before the men at the waterfall could circle down. By dawn the rain had spent itself, but not the danger. Clara spent the night in the abandoned line shack of a trapper she knew had wintered elsewhere, listening to branches scrape the roof while Ruthie slept curled against her side. The journals lay beneath Clara's palm. She did not sleep at all. Every page she turned in the lantern light widened the wound between what her father had appeared to leave and what he had actually died protecting. There had once been more than a waterfall. There had been lower timber parcels, wagon rights, creek access, even a partnership draft for a milling operation her father intended to place in trust for Clara after her husband died of fever. One by one those assets had slipped away in transactions witnessed by men loyal to Vance, notarized by names Jonathan repeatedly questioned, and rubber-stamped by offices happy to bury complaints beneath dust. He had documented it all. Not publicly. Quietly. Carefully. As if building a case for the one person stubborn enough to finish it. When the first week morning light filtered through the cracks, Clara saw something else in the final journal. Her father had marked a series of boundary stones on the northern ridge and noted a hidden adit in a quartz seam above the eastern ravine. He believed the vein linked to older territorial gold claims abandoned on paper but not in fact. If proven, the waterfall tract was not worthless land at all. It was the gateway to timber, power, and mineral rights big enough to make Vance a rich man or break him trying. Clara understood then why he had pressed so hard. He had not been buying a widow's burden. He had been trying to finish a theft. She also understood something more dangerous. A man like Garrison Vance would not back away because a grieving daughter discovered papers. He would come harder, quicker, and meaner. By noon he did. Clara had just reached her weather-beaten cabin at the lower edge of the mountain when two riders appeared through the pine brakes as neat as bad news. Garrison Vance sat his horse like a man who thought ownership flowed naturally from confidence. He wore a dark coat despite the mud and held his gloves in one hand as if calling on a lady instead of cornering prey. Sheriff Silas Cole rode beside him, broad-shouldered, mustached, and lazy-eyed, his badge flashing dull in the weak sun. Ruthie stood at the doorway with her doll while Clara split kindling by the stump, and when she saw the men she set the axe aside with deliberate calm. Vance smiled first. He said the storm had been savage and folks had worried for her safety. He said one of his lumber hands thought he saw her wandering near the falls. He said those cliff trails were treacherous, full of sinkholes and hidden cuts. Sheriff Cole added that some places on the mountain had a way of collapsing when curious people trespassed where they ought not. The meaning settled between them like a knife on a table. Clara did not flinch. She answered that the waterfall belonged to her by deed, and a woman could walk her own land without seeking permission from speculators or sheriffs. Vance's smile thinned. He glanced toward Ruthie. He remarked that mountain winters were merciless, especially for children who depended on one parent's judgment. He let the words hang. Clara felt fury rise so sharply it almost made her reckless. But reckless was what he expected from grief, from poverty, from a woman cornered into defending herself alone. So she gave him something else. She gave him stillness. She told him she had found enough on her father's land to understand why he wanted it, and enough in her father's handwriting to know any further threats would be heard in open court. For the first time, Garrison Vance's eyes changed. The charm did not vanish. Men like him never lose it completely. But it drew back just enough to show the arithmetic underneath. He had come to scare a widow. Instead he found a witness. He tipped his hat, promised the mountain could be dangerous in strange ways, and rode off with Sheriff Cole, though not before Clara caught the look that passed between them. It was not retreat. It was planning. From that hour on, the contest sharpened. A tree crashed across her access road the next day, cut too cleanly to be stormfall. Her mule disappeared from its hitching rail and returned at dusk lathered and lame. A stranger rifled her smokehouse and took nothing except the old tax receipts she had left in a tin. Someone fired a shot through her cabin window after midnight. Clara moved Ruthie's cot away from the wall and taught herself to wake at every shift in the wind. Yet fear, once acknowledged, ceased to own her. She began carrying her father's revolver. She visited the northern ridge before dawn, found the boundary stones exactly where the journals placed them, and copied each marker into a notebook of her own. She climbed the eastern ravine with blistered hands and discovered the hidden adit, narrow and choked with rock, but streaked inside with a glimmer in the quartz that made her pulse leap. She rode 30 miles to a former army surveyor named Amos Bell, an old friend of Jonathan's now half-retired near the rail spur, and placed 3 pages of the journals before him without a word. Amos read, looked up, and removed his hat. Then he told Clara her father had been the most careful landman he had ever known, which meant if Jonathan Sterling wrote fraud had been done. He agreed to verify the maps and testify if needed that he also gave her the name of an honest attorney in the county seat, a widower called Ezra Pike who had spent years losing friends by insisting documents matter more than influence. The road to town took 2 days by wagon and 1 full measure of courage. Clara left Ruthie with a pastor's wife she trusted, hid the strongest papers in the false bottom of a flour barrel, and carried the journals beneath her skirt in a belt she stitched by hand. On the second night, at a roadside boarding house, she heard Vance's men in the room below talking too freely over whiskey. They said the sheriff had already spoken to the judge's clerk. They said if the woman brought papers, the papers would disappear. They said maybe the mountain would solve the problem before court ever convened. Clara spent the night awake in a chair with the door braced and the revolver in her lap, watching the moon drag itself across the floorboards. By the time she reached the county seat, the case had become larger than inheritance. It had become a test of whether the dead could still speak and whether the living had the backbone to listen. Ezra Pike listened. He listened long and hard with both elbows on his desk while Clara laid out the letter, the journals, the copied claim maps, the forged signatures, and the tax receipts. Outside his office window, wagons rattled over muddy streets and men traded lies as casually as tobacco, but inside, each sheet of paper seemed to place another brick in a wall around the truth. Ezra told her the matter would be ugly. He told her Vance owned favors across half the district and Sheriff Cole would muddy every witness he could reach. He told her courts were not altars and justice did not descend simply because a person deserved it. Then he placed Jonathan Sterling's original survey under the lamplight and said he would file for emergency protection of the Waterfall tract before sundown. Clara left his office with a strange sensation she had nearly forgotten existed. It was not safety. It was not hope exactly. It was the first solid hint that truth, when assembled carefully enough, could become heavier than fear. If you believe a daughter's love and a mother's courage can uncover any truth hidden in the dark, hit the like button right now and leave a heart emoji in the comments. The filing brought war into daylight. By evening the town knew Clara Sterling had challenged Garrison Vance in circuit court. By morning someone had tried to pry open Ezra Pike's records room. 2 days later Amos Bell was followed on the road by men who claimed to be hunting bear. A clerk in the recorder's office suddenly remembered a fever and failed to appear when summoned to certify copies. Still the case moved forward because once papers entered official custody beyond Sheriff Cole's reach, the machinery of law, slow, imperfect, and often bent, became harder to stop completely. Clara returned to the mountain to gather Ruthie and prepare for the hearing, but the mountain was no longer waiting quietly. She found wagon tracks near the Waterfall trail and fresh pry marks on stone by the hidden ledge. Vance had tried to force his way behind the mist. When she reached the secret passage exit below the cliff, she saw shattered lantern glass and boot prints churned into the mud. They knew enough now to be dangerous in a desperate way. They did not yet know all. Clara went back through the hidden passage with a miner's hammer, more oil, and a rope. Inside the grotto cabin she secured the remaining papers, memorized the order of the journals, and discovered one final cache beneath a loose floor plank. There, wrapped in waxed hide, lay a territorial seal press, 2 affidavits signed by men long dead, and a ledger of payments made by Vance over 7 years to intermediaries whose names matched suspicious filings in the recorder's books. Bribery written in figures could become motive in court. It could also become reason for murder. She had just tucked the ledger away when a muffled blast shook dust from the beams, then another. The entrance behind the waterfall trembled. Vance and Sheriff Cole were trying to seal the grotto by blasting the outer ledge and burying the opening in rock. Clara felt the cabin lurch beneath the concussion. Mortar grit fell across the table. Water boomed harder as loose stone collapsed somewhere beyond the veil. For a terrifying second she imagined the whole cliff caving and entombing her where only her father's bones of memory might keep company. But panic solved nothing. She snatched the documents, dropped low, and fled through the rear passage as the third charge thundered against the mountain. She emerged below to a sky bruised with evening and scrambled uphill through cedar and fern until she could see the face of the falls from the side trail. Garrison Vance stood on the ledge above with Sheriff Cole and 2 laborers, shouting over the water while they wedged rock and timber into the entrance gap. They were not merely hunting evidence. They were erasing it. Clara could not reach them by force, but she did not need to. She needed witnesses. She turned and ran down the trail toward the lower camp where 3 independent teamsters had been hauling cordwood that week. By the grace that often rides nearest exhaustion, she found them at supper and pulled them uphill with the urgency of someone who had no pride left to spend. They saw the men. They saw the blasting powder. They saw the sheriff himself helping conceal a passage on land under legal injunction. That sight would matter. Men lied more carefully once other men had looked them in the eye at the moment of sin. Vance backed off before the teamsters reached the ledge, but not before Clara called his name across the thunder and told him every stone he moved now only proved how afraid he was of what lay behind it. Her voice came back to her from the ravine, amplified by water and granite until it sounded less like a widow's cry than the mountain testifying. Court convened 6 days later in a room hot with bodies, gossip, wet wool, and expectation. Clara wore black, not for performance but because she still mourned. Ruthie sat with Pastor Green's wife near the rear bench swinging her boots above the floor, too young to understand that the future of her life hung on ink and nerve. Garrison Vance entered in city-tailored confidence, silver watch chain bright against his vest, as if the whole business were an inconvenience arranged by lesser people. Sheriff Cole took his place with the stiff boredom of a man accustomed to surviving scrutiny. Ezra Pike began without flourish. He presented the original Waterfall deed, Jonathan Sterling's survey notes, the tax receipts, the unrecorded territorial claims, and expert verification from Amos Bell that the maps and boundary descriptions were authentic and consistent with official standards of the period. Then he moved, step by patient step, through the sequence of transfers that had stripped the Sterling holdings and enriched purchasers tied to Vance. Whenever Vance's attorney objected, Ezra answered with dates. Whenever Sheriff Cole smirked, Ezra produced another receipt, another witness, another contradiction. Clara testified last in the first half of the hearing, and when she rose the room seemed to lean toward her. She told no grand story. She simply gave facts. She described her father's death, the worthless deed, the purchase pressure, the storm, the hidden cabin, the letter, the journals, the ledge blasting, and the threats veiled as neighborly concern. Her voice never broke. That unsettled them more than tears would have. Vance's attorney tried to paint her as imaginative, grief-stricken, and led by desperation into fantasy. He asked whether a woman exhausted by widowhood and frontier hardship might not misread her father's intent. Clara answered that hardship had taught her to read clearly because confusion on the frontier got people buried. He asked whether she expected the court to believe a prosperous businessman had spent years forging land claims merely to steal a waterfall. Clara replied that men like Garrison Vance never steal what a thing looks like from the road. They steal what it becomes once honest people are pushed away from it. A murmur moved through the spectators so quickly the judge had to rap for order. Then Ezra introduced the ledger found under the cabin floor. The room changed. Numbers did what accusations alone could not. Payments, dates, initials, parcel codes, recorder references, and disbursements matching suspicious transfers assembled into a pattern so tight it ceased to resemble coincidence. One intermediary had already fled the district. Another, hauled in on short notice, broke under questioning and admitted he had carried signatures from Vance's office to the recorder after being told Captain Sterling was too ill to travel. Sheriff Cole denied knowledge until Ezra called one of the teamsters who had witnessed the blasting behind the waterfall after injunction papers were filed. Under oath, with 3 corroborating statements, Cole's denial began to rot in public. Sweat gathered beneath his collar. Vance himself took the stand at last, confident he could charm doubt where facts pressed too close. For a while he managed it. He smiled. He regretted misunderstandings. He praised Jonathan Sterling's service. He claimed his purchases were legal, his records proper, his concern for Clara entirely Christian. But Ezra Pike had saved his cruelest question for the end. He placed Jonathan Sterling's private letter before Vance and asked why a man who supposedly believed his dealings honest would spend months attempting to buy, seize, threaten, and then physically conceal the only tract Captain Sterling had withheld from him. Vance hesitated. It was small, but fatal. In that breath of delay, every eye in the courtroom saw what greed looks like when truth removes its costume. Clara watched the judge study the forged signatures, the sealed discrepancies, the chain of payments, and the contradictory testimony, and she felt time fold strangely in on itself. She could almost sense her father in the room, not as a ghost, but as intention made visible at last. Years of caution, lonely note-keeping, and hidden labor had led here, into this hot chamber of law where a daughter carried his unfinished stand across the line. When Ezra concluded, silence held for a long and fragile moment. Then the judge ruled. He voided the fraudulent transfers pending criminal inquiry, upheld Clara Sterling's title to the Waterfall tract and connected claims, recognized the newly authenticated territorial filings, and issued an order placing the disputed holdings under protection until full valuation and restoration could be completed. Garrison Vance's expression did not crack immediately. Men who live by domination rarely understand defeat on first impact. But as the meaning spread through the room, as whispers sharpened into astonishment and the sheriff's face went the color of old ash, Vance finally looked at Clara not as a nuisance or a widow or a woman to be cornered, but as the force that had ended him. Would you have had the courage to step behind that roaring wall of water into the unknown to protect your child's future? Type yes in the comments if you would have done the exact same thing. The months that followed were not magically easy, because victory in court is only the birth of responsibility, not the end of struggle. Survey crews had to be hired. Boundaries had to be remarked, claims had to be registered correctly in distant offices, timber contracts had to be negotiated with men who still preferred dealing over a woman's head until she made the cost of underestimating her too painful to bear. But Clara Sterling had spent too many years being measured by what she lacked to now fear the scale of what she possessed. She established a lawful milling partnership first, using the lower pine stands exactly as her father had planned, careful to cut selectively and preserve the watershed that powered the mountain run. She reopened the hidden adit under engineer supervision, and though the first yields were modest, the ore proved strong enough to draw investment from people who valued clarity of title above backroom favors. She hired widows to keep books, veterans to guard the routes, and local families long squeezed by Vance's tactics to work timber, haul loads, mend tack, and expand the camp into a settlement that could feed itself through winter. The waterfall that men had mocked as a useless inheritance became the heart of a thriving estate, driving saws, drawing trade, and turning a ravine once haunted by theft into a corridor of lawful prosperity. As for Sheriff Cole, his badge did not survive the inquiries that followed. As for Garrison Vance, he discovered that a reputation built on influence collapses faster than a rotten bridge once honest records reach honest hands. Some said he left the region under cover of dark. Others said creditors chased him east. Clara never asked which story was true. She had lost enough years to his shadow already. What mattered was the life ahead. Ruthie grew among pine fragrance, hammer songs, lamplight, and the fierce tenderness of a mother who had walked through water and stone to secure her future. The hidden cabin behind the falls was not destroyed after all. Though the outer ledge had been damaged, Clara rebuilt the approach and kept the place private, preserving her father's table, compass, journals, and cedar chest as they had been found, not as relics of grief but as proof that love sometimes protects by preparing long before it is understood. On certain evenings, when the mist turned gold and the mountain wind moved softly through the gorge, Clara would sit inside that secret room with Ruthie beside her and read aloud from Captain Sterling's journals, not the pages of fraud and danger, but the ones where he described deer tracks after snowfall, the angle of morning light on wet granite, the patience required to measure a river honestly, and the duty of leaving the world steadier than one found it. In time people spoke of Clara Sterling with the same respect once reserved only for men who conquered rough country with rifles and maps. But Clara had done something rarer. She had not conquered the mountain. She had listened to it. She had trusted the warning in a useless deed, the instinct that refused a greedy offer, the whisper of truth behind ridicule, and the narrow path hidden behind the loudest and most frightening thing in her life. That is how legacies are truly saved. Not by comfort. Not by easy applause. Not by inheritance laid neatly on a table for the deserving. They are saved by the souls willing to keep walking when the storm takes away the road, by the hands that shake and still reach for the lantern, by mothers who understand that fear is not the opposite of courage but the place where courage begins its work. Jonathan Sterling had left his daughter a waterfall, and the world thought he had left her nothing. But inside that thunder he had left her evidence, refuge, warning, and a doorway. More than that, he had left her the chance to become fully herself. And Clara, soaked by grief and hunted by greed, stepped through. So when life seems to hand you only noise, only ruin, only some wild impossible burden no one else would choose, remember the woman on the mountain who discovered that what looks worthless from a distance may conceal the very truth meant to redeem your name. Remember that the loudest trials often hide the quietest mercies. Remember that one brave step into the unknown can change not only a child's future, but the meaning of everything a family thought it had lost. If Clara's story touched your heart today, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below with legacy so we know you stood with her until the very end.